Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. I apologize for my absence last week. Busy week, I'm sure you all understand, but we're going to get into it. So, just for starters, happy Easter to all, and I don't need to split up my Easter wishes this year because the two dates on the two calendars lined up this year. But I have plenty of news to cover from these past 2 weeks, so I'm going to try to be brief about some of it, not dwell too much, and hopefully get as much knocked out of the way as I can. So we're going to be treading on some old ground, some stuff from last week, and I know that a week can feel like a year under these kind of circumstances. But without further ado, we'll get right into it, starting with a Ukraine frontline update. Now, insofar as advancements on the front line, I'm not going to get down into granular detail with the map, simply out of interest of time, so I'm just going to give you some brief updates. Because the events surrounding Ukraine are much more significant these past couple weeks than what actually happened on the battlefield. Not to downplay it, but I'll get into the talks and the negotiation, the stuff about the Sumi strike and the controversy surrounding that, and everything else. And we will tackle this over the next hour and a half or so, so we'll get right into it. So, briefly, we have Russian advances continuing in the Kupiansk and Svatove directions. Fighting does continue with stiff resistance from the Ukrainians in the Chasiv Yar and Pokrovsk directions. As for the Kursk offensive, we still have the Ukrainians bitterly holding out at Aleshnya and Gornal, which are the two cities in Kursk on the border of Sumy Oblast. And as a result of that, you have had the Russians push into the Sumy Oblast, and many parts of Sumy proper, the city of Sumy, are now under fire control, which will lead us into our story about the Sumy strikes on Palm Sunday and some of the controversy surrounding that, the narratives that were spun around that, and really trying to get a bit deeper into it. I know this is going to sound strange over something that's only 2 weeks old, but this is in many ways old news with what has happened so far. But I do feel the need to address it because of how centered it was and the narratives they tried to spin around it. So I'll get into that before I get into some stuff about the negotiations and the Easter ceasefire, etc. So the initial reports said that the Russians, in a terror bombing campaign, decided to strike a church in Sumi City on Palm Sunday. And then the details gradually started coming out. Now, there were civilian casualties in the strike. I'm not going to condone that. I'm not going to try to justify that. But I am going to explain the circumstances around this where, yes, there were civilian casualties, and once again, I in no way am condoning that and no way justifying it. I'll get into my personal opinion on whether or not the strike should have taken place. But to explain the circumstances, what we know because of Mariana Bezuglaya, who is the I guess you could say firebrand. Maybe that's a little bit too generous, but the outspoken member of the Ukrainian Rada, who is often a critic of Zelensky government policy, but not direction, of course, is in consensus with the regime on the war, but is often critical about the particulars of the war. You'll recall that she visited parts of the front line in Pokrovsk and pointed out the deficiencies in defense, has talked very frankly about some of the problems with the military command. In fact, actually, I believe it was her. I believe what the story was, this would have been a year and a half ago, where she accused many in the Ukrainian staff of dividing the spoils of war, quote unquote, with the Russians and playing the game to lose, so to speak. But with what we know, particularly because of her, and among other information sources about what happened in Sumi, is that it was a military award ceremony for the troops that had been operating in the Kursk direction. And as you know, if you've been following this, which I imagine most, if not all, of you have, Kursk has been the site of some of the more brutal Ukrainian activity during this war, and it has given way to much more vengeful behavior by the Russians. And as we've seen with some of the offensives, or counteroffensives more appropriately, into Kursk over the past 6 to 8 months. But with what we know from Bezyglaya, there was a geolocated image showing the Ukrainian triangle tactical sign on a pickup truck, and this was the symbol that the forces operating the Kursk direction used, and of course Sumi and Kursk are right next to the border with each other. And then the mayor of Konotop, which is a city in Sumy Oblast, said on a live stream that the awarding of certificates and medals for the 117th Territorial Defense Brigade was taking place there. And also, the 117th was formed on April 13th, which was the same day as the strike, exactly 6 years ago. So it was an anniversary celebration on top of a military award celebration. Now, civilians were invited to this event. It did take place in an area that was vulnerable to Russian strikes, and blame started coming down quickly. There was the initial outrage against the Russians for having conducted the strike with civilian casualties, and perhaps some of you are going to disagree with me, and I am, of course, completely fine with that. I'm not going to be tyrannical about what my audience thinks about my opinions. So speak freely, please. Let me know if you disagree with me. I do think the cost that was paid was not worth it. I understand that, yes, there were high-ranking officers at this ceremony, that there was probably a certain vein of vengeance that ran with this, with these troops having participated in the Kursk offensive. But I do think, number one, morally, number two, tactically, it was a bad move in terms of Russian conduct in this war. Because the Russians have, more or less, in my opinion, and perhaps I'm being too biased here, have played their hand rather steadily with this war to the point where confirmed numbers on both sides shows only about 13,000 civilian casualties. Now that is 13,000 people who are dead now. I don't want to downplay that. Civilians who had no involvement in this war, and I'm sure you could say in some isolated cases some of them probably did take up arms or did put themselves in dangerous situations. But putting all that aside, 13,000 people over the course of 3+ years, like I said, not to downplay the value of any of these people's lives. Considering other wars, I mean, let's just look at Gaza for a moment. Let's look at the Syrian Civil War. Let's look at the Iraq War. Is rather minuscule for what could have been. And with all of that happening, with that out there, the fact that I think the Russians probably should have stayed their hand, especially considering the day it took place on. Now, I know they conflate the propaganda saying the Russians just terror bombed a church, when no, that was not the case. They probably could have stayed their hand here, and this situation didn't need to happen in the first place. Now, it doesn't seem like this is going to stick. It doesn't seem like the outrage machine is what it once was, where they could drum up the same sort of outcry in the West, who, even outside the United States, even in Europe, there is a certain level of exhaustion. Maybe not from the political class, or at least some parts of the political class, but there is a certain level of exhaustion with Ukraine and a desire to more or less wrap up the conflict, even if we being the West, do have to take some egg on our face. But after more details about these strikes came out, blame started to trickle down to the government, particularly the regional governor of Sumi, and also on local officials. Zelensky passed blame on the Sumi governor and also onto the Lugansk governor Artem Lyoshor, and the Sumi governor being Volodymyr Artyhuk, and the official governor, according to the Ukrainians, of Lugansk being Artem Lyoshor, who Lugansk Oblast is more or less completely under Russian control, so his office is just a mere formality. He is there in exile, and of course Sumi and Lugansk do border each other. But the blame for the ceremony was laid at their feet, and they were sacked because of that, and the whole thing was swept under the rug. When it came to international condemnations, the G7 tried to put out a statement, but the United States under Trump did veto that statement, and there was no coherent G7 statement. And it looked like when this news was brought to Trump's attention, because of the ongoing peace negotiations, he was rather eager to just not discuss it, which, like I said, not to downplay the civilian lives lost, because I do think when these kind of conflicts get talked about, and I do think people are a bit better on the Israel-Palestine conflict when it comes to this because of how blatant these civilian casualties are. But when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, I feel like people tend to get lost in the weeds because it is a much more conventional war. You don't exactly think civilian casualties. You don't exactly think terror bombing of cities, even though that has happened, admittedly, especially with drone attacks. And we've seen, of course, Ukrainian waves of drones attacks. And in fact, if anything, the Ukrainians more likely to target civilian infrastructure and civilian targets in terror bombing campaigns, not even necessarily strategic campaigns that involve civilian infrastructure. And I'm once again, I do want to put out there that I'm not just trying to run defense for the Russians. I'm trying to put something of an objective view out there, despite my personal biases. But 1 week later, this did lead into the Easter ceasefire, which took place over the course of Saturday night into Sunday morning. Now, as I had said, the dates for Easter, I do think this is important, lined up on the Western and Eastern calendars. So it was a great PR move, regardless, for the Russians to pursue this. Now, there were a number of ceasefire violations, and under the ceasefire command that was given to the Russian forces, they had every right to repel any troops and defend themselves, but they were ordered to cease offensive operations. And I'll just go over a brief timeline of the events of the ceasefire. So, on the 20th April, in accordance with the Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, the quote-unquote North Group observed the ceasefire. Over the course of the day, the enemy violated ceasefire on numerous occasions, launching indiscriminate attacks by UAV and artillery, as well as attempting to break through the territory of the Belgorod region 12 times. 5 AFU assault groups each move in the direction of Popovka and Demidovka, which are the two towns on the border of the Belgorod region, as well as 2 in the direction of Goptarov. Now, these are, of course, reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense, so you can take them with a grain of salt. But I do think, pursuing the Russian official narrative here, reading over the reports, it does give you a generally good idea. Like I said, don't take it at face value, but it gives you a general timeline of what some of the ceasefire violations were according to the Russians. And in the morning, 3 AFU assault groups left Miropolskoye and crossed the state border and took cover in a forest belt. 2 more tried to infiltrate the sector of the front during the day. 5 times the enemy tried to break through the territory of Krasnoyayorsk district through forest areas. The Northerners used helicopters to indicate the enemy attack aircraft full control over this section of the state border. The invaders stopped moving and hid in the thicket. 2 enemy groups were discovered while moving in the direction of the village of Goptorovka. The North UAV operators made it clear to the enemy that a breakthrough into our territory was impossible, after which the enemy aircraft fled into the forest of the Sumi region. The enemy personnel are aware they are in the crosshairs of our means for destruction. Negotiations are underway for the surrender of the occupants as prisoners of war. 2 AFU men contacted Russian servicemen. Threat chatbot immediately after being assigned to the 225th. In total, during the past week, 14th April to 20th April, the enemy made 18 attempts to transfer reinforcements to the Popovka area. Once again, that's near Belgorod-Sumi border, totaling over 80 men. Most of the living force were destroyed, and the rest fled to Sumi region. The AFU soldiers repeatedly tried to attack civilian infrastructure in Belgorod region with FPV drones. In the village of Nechayevka, 2 children and a woman were injured by an FPV drone attack. All in the hospital, they are provided with the necessary assistance. In the Sumi direction, the enemy also repeatedly violated the ceasefire regime. On the territory of the Sujan border area, the North Koreans concentrated the main efforts demanding evacuation of civilians as well as the removal of body of Ukrainian servicemen to Russian morgues. Of course, that's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment about the North Koreans who are allegedly in Kursk, and now the Chinese, as I covered last week, but I digress. The group's engineering unit continued demining the Sujin border area. Over the past 24 hours, almost 13,000 explosive objects have been neutralized. During the evacuation of civilians from Guevo, our servicemen came under a massive raid by FPV drones. The enemy also made attempts to remove at remote mining using heavy helicopters. All UAV drones were shot down. Groups of Russian servicemen who were attempting to transport the bodies of Ukrainian occupants from the vicinity of Guevo and Nikolaev Dorino to Russian morgues also came under fire from enemy artillery. The Kiev regime realizes the conditions of relatives of missing Ukrainian servicemen. The Ukro-Nazis realize that most wives and mothers have already come to terms with the death of a loved one, and they just want to give their husband, son, or brother a decent burial. Once again, coming from the source who is translating the Russian LOD reports, that is, like I said, a bit more tongue-in-cheek stuff with the Ukraine Nazis. These aren't things that are actually in the Ministry of Defense reports, but these are the ones I pulled for, and I just want to read the translation as is to avoid any confusion. However, the AFU command is doing everything to ensure that the remains of AFU soldiers are not removed from the battlefield. The enemy did not conduct counterattacks in Volchansky and Lipsy directions. At the same time, the enemy actively used heavy helicopters of the Baba Yaga type. Over 20 enemy UAV drones were shot down during the day in these directions. So, that is just a brief detailing of the Easter ceasefire. Now, I believe the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed something in the ballpark of 5,000 individual violations of the ceasefire, and of course that could be anything from one individual to concerted military efforts on the part of the Ukrainians. But there was some gesture of goodwill. It did allow the Russians some time to regroup, and also, like I said, did buy them some PR. Now, the last time this kind of ceasefire was conducted was the 7th of January 2023 in observance of Orthodox Christmas, and it was to a similar result where it wasn't really honored or upheld by particularly the Ukrainian side, but I suppose that was to be expected, and that these gestures of goodwill are necessary times, even speaking from a political point of view, not necessarily the kindness of the hearts of, say, the Russian leadership or the Ukrainian leadership, but simply because it's what's pragmatic and optics reasons, really. Now, one last thing I will add before getting into the diplomatic side of the Ukraine situation is the numbers that came from the recent body exchange between the Russian and the Ukrainian forces. And just over the course of the past few body exchanges, I'll give you the dates and the amounts. So, referencing the exchange on the 18th of October 2024, 89 Russians for 501 Ukrainians. November 8th, 2024, 37 Russians for 563 Ukrainians. 29th of November 2024, 52 Russians for 502 Ukrainians. The 20th of December 2024, 42 Russians for 503 Ukrainians. The 24th of January of 2025 had 49 Russians for 757 Ukrainians. The 14th of February 2025 had 45 Russians for 757 Ukrainians. Then getting into more recent figures, the 28th of March 2025 had 43 Russians for 909 Ukrainians, and similar figures coming out from the 18th of April 2025 for 41 Russians and 909 Ukrainians. Now, it is worth noting, while I do think the casualty numbers are certainly lopsided in Russia's favor, they're taking far less casualties, especially at this point in the war, the Russians, being the advancing force, are more easily able to recover the bodies of the fallen as they advance. So that is worth considering. However, it's not the full picture. But for the sake of objectivity, for the sake of looking at the situation in its entirety, that is one piece of information that does need to be taken into consideration. Now, moving on to the negotiations in Ukraine, I'll start with some of the preliminary statements from it, and that is Zelensky could not help himself but criticized the Trump administration again, this time particularly in a 60 Minutes interview where he criticized Trump, Vance, and Witkoff in particular, as well as other members of the administration. And Vance did respond to Zelensky's statements, which included statements such as the United States, quote unquote, talks more warmly with the Russians than the Ukrainians, and that it's unproductive rhetoric and absurdity. So Vance did explicitly come out and criticize Zelensky. Once again, more along the lines of what he was doing, say, during the big White House Oval Office showdown, where he more or less called him an ingrate, which I can't necessarily disagree with, all personal biases aside. And of course, he insulted Witkoff as well, and implied that because of his lack of a quote unquote diplomatic background, he wasn't qualified to be in this negotiating position. When Witkoff, think what you will of him, I think there are some legitimate criticisms to be had, but he's the most competent diplomat the Americans have at this point. It's pathetic compared to, say, Rubio, the actual Secretary of State, or Walls, the National Security Advisor, even Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, still has to deal in some diplomatic capacity. One of Trump's cronies from the real estate world is running circles around them. It's pathetic, frankly. But I didn't expect greatness, but if this is the best we can do, I'm not going to complain that much. I'm going to have my criticisms, but I'm not going to complain that much. So, the recent talks revolve around Trump's deadline, which is getting the Russians and Ukrainians to agree to a deal before the 30th of April, before he quote unquote walks away. That's his big threat. Now, what that means, whether that's walk away from the negotiating table, walk away from the conflict entirely, leaving Ukraine to its own devices, or just canceling diplomacy and continuing the status quo, it could really mean any of the above. I could very easily see a situation where they do revert back to the status quo, where the arms are drip-fed to Ukraine, maybe not directly by the United States, but through the Europeans, who have not relented on their support for Ukraine, foolishly, in my opinion. But I don't think we've seen the end of this unless the Pentagon, unless the American empire is truly anticipating a large event that would distract them in either the Asia Pacific or the Middle East. Now, I know there are the ongoing negotiations with Iran, also involving Witkoff, that I will get into later in the episode. So, like I said, I think it would take, in order for the Americans to completely wash their hands of the situation, it would take a much larger distraction than Trump growing frustrated with the two parties. However, some speculate that him going forward with the Kellogg proposal, which I'll get into some of the brief details of for those of you who haven't kept up with the nitty-gritty of the diplomacy. Some are speculating that the Kellogg proposal is an excuse for Trump to walk away from the negotiating table and leave Ukraine to its own devices after inevitably the Russians and the Ukrainians do not accept. So, the brief points of the Kellogg plan, that of course being General Keith Kellogg, who is one of Trump's envoys for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, does include a recognition of Crimea as Russian territory and the refusal to accept Ukraine to NATO. It also would allow the Russians to maintain the territories they have captured in a de facto sense, but not a de jure sense, where they still would recognize Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk as part of Ukraine, but they would have a, I suppose, unofficial understanding that these territories are effectively Russian. And this would not involve the evacuation of Ukrainian troops from current positions, but it would involve a DMZ, the introduction of European troops. But to continue, the U.S. is now waiting for Zelensky's response, and Zelensky's response does not look like it's going to be perceived positively. Um, and then one of the other points which might make people think this is a complete throwaway plan is American administration of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant because of how contentious it's been during the war. Now, the Russians have controlled it since 2022. The Ukrainians have made attempts to try to recapture it. The Ukrainians have opened fire on it. But the proposal is the Americans will administer it as a quote unquote neutral mediating power, which would provide electricity and resources from the plant to both sides of the proposed DMZ. But once again, we know that they're trying to really bail the Ukrainians out, and that it also plays to, say, Trump's more transactional instincts. And this does also get into the mineral deal, which is as nebulous as ever, really. I don't think anyone's really quite made sense of the mineral deal. I certainly haven't. I go back and forth on what its purpose is. The plan did not mention explicit security guarantees for Ukraine, and Trump also did not say whether they would provide military support to European countries if they were to have a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. Now, the Europeans insist, particularly the French and the British, that a peacekeeping force along a DMZ is a necessity for them to accept any sort of Ukrainian peace proposal. And some have speculated, not unreasonably so, that this is particularly the British and to a lesser extent the French trump card, no pun intended, to keep the Americans involved in the conflict. Because if some sort of ceasefire is reached, the British and the French are going to move forces in. You had bizarre proposals with, say, Poland administering the ports of Odessa in the event of a ceasefire, as well as being bolstered by, say, British and French troops as well. But even among the Europeans, you have Britain, France, and the Baltic states are really the only country that have assented to this. Germany, even with Merz set to come into power, is not going to do it. Sure, they want to remilitarize Germany and prepare for a wider conflict, and also have the military-industrial complex to support Ukraine's war effort. The Italians, Maloney is already being sent as, say, the mediator between the Europeans and Trump on a number of issues, from Ukraine to trade policy, etc., NATO as well. But even Poland, despite the fact that there was the speculation that they might administer the ports of Odessa, that wasn't even necessarily billed as, say, a military deployment, but rather just civil administration. Now, of course, everyone's trying to dig their tendrils in Ukraine and get what value they can out of it while it's still standing, while they can still play the role of a vulture, as it were. But among even the European governments, among even the Eurocrats, this is simply not a feasible proposal. Because, number one, the French and the British militaries are not in any condition to be administering any sort of DMZ in any real sense. And the question is, if hostilities were to resume, would these troops participate in combat? Would they be a tripwire in order to turn this into a wider NATO war? But already you have Trump refusing to say whether or not he would give security guarantees if the situation were to deteriorate to the point where NATO troops in Ukraine playing a role of peacekeeper were attacked, if that would constitute an American response to the Russians or an American support for the Ukrainian and or European war effort. So it's all very hazy. And like I said, it does lead one to believe that this is Trump's off ramp. So he can make it look like, well, he tried, but at the end he just couldn't get through to them, so he's moving on. The Europeans can pick up the pieces what they want. But, I mean, that also plays into, say, the Hegseth division of labor theory and some of the information coming out of the Pentagon, which I'll touch on later because I think there's growing evidence to back that up. It seems like more and more every day. But the question is, how much of a role would the Americans be willing to play in supporting the Europeans, even if they were to, say, outsource confrontation with Russia to them? But as for the Russian side, they're also in really no position where I think they would accept this, because the biggest concessions are the recognition of Crimea as a legal part of the Russian Federation and the removal of post 2014 sanctions. And also, keep in mind, the Europeans have not assented to either of those points. And I know that they said for their London summit in support for Ukraine that they're just going to completely disregard the Trump peace plan, which I'll get into in just a moment here. But the Russians are on the offensive. They have strategic initiative in this war. The Ukrainian war effort becomes less and less viable every day. The Europeans, as much as they want to bark, they don't have the bite to match it. And functionally, recognition of the territory means nothing. The sanctions mean little. I'm sure sanctions relief would be welcome for the Russian economy, that the investors would probably like that the business class would probably like that. But they've shown over the course of these past 3 years, and you want to go back further, since 2014, that they can operate their economies semi-independently of the West. Now, of course, there are third-party traders who do help them skirt the sanctions. Think some of the Central Asian states, even Serbia, China, of course, India, some of the Middle Eastern states, including the Gulf states. Egypt was another one that was helping them circumvent sanctions. So they're not entirely divorced from Western economy. But as we've seen, they are not as beholden to it as, say, just about any other nation in the world. And there's nothing here substantially that I think would benefit the Russians. it's just no reason to do so. Now, the Russian response from this came from Peskov, who is one of the spokesmen for Putin, and he said in an interview that the Ukrainians must withdraw from Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, and saying, quote, if Kiev pulls out now, the conflict ends immediately, where they would settle for that. Now, I'm sure there's more to that than meets the eye, or the ear in this case. But some of the other points from the interview were that Putin respects Trump because he is a strong political figure and a strong personality. A meeting between Putin and Trump should be productive, and preparatory work is currently underway. Russia has no territorial claims against the Baltic states. Europeans try to lecture Russia on democracy, even though they often violate the principles themselves. Russia seeks negotiations while Europe seeks war. Russia does not intend to attack anyone. Russia will achieve its goals either by peaceful or military means, and Russia has learned to live under sanctions while the EU, they have caused major problems, that the sanctions have backfired. Trump has not set a deadline for establishing a ceasefire in Ukraine. Russia does also not consider it inappropriate to impose timeframes. And relations between Russia and the West are at a deadlock. For now, Moscow is trying to establish dialogue with Washington. Neither Macron or any other European leader wants to listen to Putin when he told them Russia had been concerned in terms of its security. So, as for Peskov's statements, now of course he's speaking in an official capacity, that he's not going to be telling the whole story. There are of course going to be things going on behind the scenes. On the Russian side, I could see some concerns about Minsk 3, and that's the term that I've seen from some of the Russian sources I've interacted with, just people I know personally or through other channels of communication. Of course, no public officials. I'm just talking about average, everyday Russians and of that sort. Like I said, nobody high profile. At least I don't think any of them are FSB agents or are working for the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But well, I don't know. What do I know? Perhaps there's glowies everywhere on all sides. But with that being said, this could be viewed as something of a half measure, where the Russians, who have committed, I would say, at least 75,000 lives and billions of dollars worth of resources, and also more or less, change its fundamental relationship with the Europeans for years, if not decades, to come. This does seem like a half measure. Now, sure, you can talk about the Europeans won't have the security guarantees, but if we're to take Peskov and the Kremlin at their word, at face value, that the Ukrainians do withdraw and the conflict ceases, of course the Russians are going to push in negotiations for, say, rights of ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and also the status of neutrality. But, as we've seen, the Europeans are willing to move peacekeepers in, and will this war have been fought to its military conclusion, as the Russians do keep saying, if you end up with European troops in Odessa? Is it acceptable to the Russian public, or even the interest of, say, the Russian state and their external security, that Odessa and Nikolaev, and even going on to say like Dnipropetrovsk or Kharkiv, is it acceptable that they remain under Ukrainian control, even under a neutral Ukrainian state? Or is this just turning the clock back 10 years and bringing it back to another frozen conflict with a little bit more advantageous lines for the Russians? Or is this an actual viable solution where they can put in a, say, Lukashenko-style leader in Ukraine and make sure that the Ukrainian state is going to respect their interests, as it were, and is going to be conciliatory towards the Russians? Even Belarus they still have problems with, not to the extent that they used to. So there is a dangerous game being played here. And it is a precarious situation because, as we've discussed on previous shows, there is extensive reconstruction work that is going to need to be done in these newly acquired areas. Even Mariupol's reconstruction has been quite expensive. I know that's been the jewel of, say, the Russian reconstruction effort in the newly annexed territories. But when it comes to some of these villages that were, say, no more than 10,000 people before the war, are these just going to be left as piles of rubble? Are they going to just become ghost towns? Where are the Russians going to get the money to rebuild these? Are they going to be able to court Chinese investment? Will China want to take on these business interests? How shrewd of a partner is China going to be in this? Can they court Indian money or Gulf state money? So there's a lot of considerations where one could say, and I think there's quite ample reason to say, if the Russians don't push this war at least to Odessa, then in many ways it could be a Pyrrhic victory, or it could even be a failure. And that they had put themselves in a maybe more comfortable position, but they're still in the thick of it. And I don't want to see this war continue. I think the fact that we're having another major war on the European continent especially is a disaster. And returning to some of the reconstruction costs, you have people whose homes will never be rebuilt. You have people who are going to be displaced permanently, even people from the areas that weren't heavily impacted by the conflict. Look at the numbers of immigrants from Ukraine. And I've said previously, if the West is to take in any refugees, if it's to take in any foreigners, Ukrainians are not a bad choice. And that even for the interest of depriving Zelensky his war machine, I do support blanket asylum for pretty much any Ukrainian who is not provably part of one of these schizo ultranationalist groups. And that, yeah, I would be fine living next to these people. Sure, I might disagree with them politically. Sure, I might think that they cling on to some ideas of petty nationalism, but these aren't exactly people from the subcontinent or sub-Saharan Africa or who knows where and what part of the Middle East, claiming to be refugees from what country. So I think that, yes, you're never going to get those people to return. Many of them have made lives for themselves in the West. Many of them have started to integrate. They have found jobs. They've found homes. They've started families. Speaking from personal experience, just a large diaspora community near me It has seen an influx of people whose relatives, whose friends, whose family have come over. They've established themselves, and they likely are not going anywhere. And as I said previously, I don't even necessarily mind that. I'm sure it comes with its own set of challenges, but if there's any immigration to complain about, it's not that. So, while the war itself may seem close to an end, close to a military end, the fallout of this conflict is going to be something that really does stay with Europe and, frankly, the world for years, if not decades to come. Are the Europeans going to reconcile with Russia? Are they going to participate in the reconstruction? Their economies are on the fritz as it is. Are the Americans? The Americans see more interest in extracting wealth from the rest of the world right now rather than doling it out. And then there's the question of the other BRICS countries. How willing are they to, say, invest in a Ukrainian reconstruction fund? And on that note, let's talk about the mineral deal again, where the mineral deal is supposed to be the Americans have control over the resources where they put it into a reconstruction fund for Ukraine, similar to what they do with the oil profits for Iraq. But that money gets embezzled, it goes to political favors, it goes to offshore bank accounts. We all know how that works out. So you're going to have this massive black hole in Europe, and perhaps that's the plan to turn the rump Ukrainian state into a black hole that's really impossible for either the Europeans or the Russians to cross in order to keep a balance of power on the continent, similar to, say, what the British Empire would have pursued for most of its history, and that policy being adopted by the American Empire. But as for the ultimate outcome with that, I frankly don't know. And there's only so much you can say before really exhausting your options here. But I guess I could talk about, on that note, some of the coalition of the willing, and that is, of the 30 countries that are part of the coalition of the willing, there are only 6 countries willing to commit military forces, and that was Britain, the UK, France, the UK, the Baltic states, and one other one. I think they might have counted Poland, who keeps waffling back and forth in the situation, but there's simply no path forward for that. And to quote Arestovich, because I think he made a prescient point despite some of his more absurd tendencies, when he was giving an interview, he said, well, yes, Zelensky should accept this because we can either lose 4 regions now or wait 6 months and lose 8 regions as the Russians continue to advance. And I think he has a point. The Russians have shown that they are open to further advances. If you're to take Medvedev at his word, they are willing to hold more referenda for the annexation of more territory, which, from a Russian perspective, might be for the best, even with some of the challenges that may involve. But I still think, and perhaps I'm too caught up in the issue, and if there's any Russians listening to this or anyone who maybe has more of an ear to the ground on the domestic situation in Russia, I think leaving Odessa outside of Russian hands, if we're to look at the overall cause and goals of this war, to leave Odessa outside of Russian hands, it seems like, I'm not going to say it was all for naught, but it seems like or that the Russians have not accomplished, say, one of the major goals they would have set out for, which is the reintegration of this land, which is the, I guess what they would say, protection of their co-ethnics, and that's still a contentious issue, and I think that it could come back to haunt Russia, speaking from their perspective, if they don't pursue their maximalist goals. Because, I mean, we know, we've seen the military impotence of the West. We see Trump's unwillingness to really get involved further. If there were time to do so, I know that there's talk of the general summer offensive coming up. We'll see if that actually does come to fruition. But if there were any time to do it, given the military and the political circumstances, it would be now. But moving on to, once again, broader questions of the outcome of the Ukraine war, normalization talks between Russia and the United States do continue to relative success. The most recent one was on the 10th of April in Istanbul, with Russian and U.S. delegates meeting, exchanging a final mutual understanding on ensuring stability and return to diplomatic services between the Russian and the U.S. diplomatic missions. And the U.S. reiterated its concern about Russia's policy of prohibiting the hiring of local personnel, which is a key obstacle to maintaining stable staffing levels at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And also, you have the Deputy Assistant Secretary to the Secretary of State and the Russian ambassador Darkiev discussing dates for a follow up meeting in the near future and also finding a location, a venue to host these talks. Despite everything, even if Ukraine talks do stall out, it does look like Trump is dedicated to at least some degree of normalization between U.S. Russian relations, which, once again, I'll give him all the credit in the world for. We can talk about the broader implications behind that, how it's not what it seems like it is on the surface, but returning to that level of diplomacy between two countries that have the power to destroy the world 10 times over, at least, is not a negative development in any sense of the word. But looking at the exact opposite end of that, let's talk about Europe. And particularly some economic figures that are coming out of Europe right now. And that is the Germans have reassessed their budget, that economic growth will be at 0.00%, down from 0.01%. So there has been, I'm sorry, 0.1%. So there has been a concession that the economy is stagnated. Where France is doing slightly better, their economy is slated for 0.9% growth, but also compare these figures to inflation numbers. It's not nearly enough. And I'm not going to turn into a GDP worshiper, but these figures are concerning for anyone in Europe. And we've seen the consequences of that. We've seen what the sanctions war has done. We've seen the fallout from COVID. We've seen the consequences of the quote-unquote green energy agenda. And it's Europe's economy right now. I know the American economy has its own issues. I'm not going to downplay those. Once again, I try not to be triumphalist about these kind of things because I'm not that much more optimistic about the state of America. But one report that came out, and this may be a bit of a sensationalist headline, that almost half of the French have cut back on their hygiene products. Now, don't make the joke. Don't make the joke. I'm not going to make the joke. You guys can make the joke. Telegram channels made the joke, but this comes from French outlet Le Figaro. A third of those surveyed wear clothes longer to use less detergent, and some of them have even learned to do without toothpaste. And they cite economic hardship because of that. 8 million people in France are forced to make a choice, eat or wash. We must mobilize to help them, commented Dominique Besancon, who is a director for Dons Solidaires Association in France, which is one of these humanitarian organizations, one of these many NGOs in the NGO complex. And we've seen these kind of stories from Europe for the past 3+ years with their pitiful economic situation. We talked about some of the energy crises going on in the UK, of course in Germany as well, the deindustrialization of Germany in particular after the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. And it's going to continue until they can either A, find an alternative source of energy, and I know that because of the current trade disputes, Trump is demanding of them, as I had mentioned previously, that they import $350 billion worth of American LNG. They've tried to enter into or American natural gas, I should say. They've tried to enter into talks with the Canadians using them as an alternate energy source, which may also explain Trump's insistence on the Canada issue and having them cede more economic control of the United States. I think the annexation thing is just a meme. It's Trump being Trump. But I do think there's a serious concerted effort to push further economic integration between the U.S. and Canada to the advantage of the United States, and having them have more of a stake in the Canadian economy. But aside from that, they also do have the option of engaging in the peace process. This is the golden opportunity. Trump has put before them. And this is what happens all the time when it comes to the Europeans and Trump. You can go back to his first term. Trump, either advertently or inadvertently, will present the Europeans with a golden opportunity to express some degree of independence from the United States. But what they do every time is they choose to double down on Atlanticism. You saw this from Macron today saying we won't abandon Ukraine, blah, 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 showing his defiance to Washington by continuing a war that Washington dragged them into. It's as coherent as it sounds. But one thing that did strike me as kind of funny over the past couple weeks is that as leverage against Trump in the trade war, which the trade war has mostly abated, but the tariffs do remain in place, is that in their next round of sanctions packages, the Europeans have pushed for making caveats for Russian energy, similar to, say, the ones that Hungary get. Maybe not quite that extensive, but this is after the severing of energy contracts between Russia and Poland and Russia and the Baltic states that went into effect New Year's of this year. And now the Europeans, in order to pump some money into their economy, in order to have, say, more affordable energy and maybe stabilize the situation and also have some leverage over Trump in trade talks, decide all of a sudden maybe it's time to entertain the idea of EU energy and or Russian energy from the European Union. But I don't think this is actually going to happen. Even if it does, it's going to be a one-time exception. It's not going to be nearly enough sanctions relief to meet Europe's needs. And the question is, how much energy is Russia willing to allocate to the European markets at this point? When they found a great deal of success off the European markets, particularly with China, also India, and just across the world, really, where the so-called Eurasian economic bloc has become much more of a reality. They've established their north-south corridor with the Iranians, and they're able to ship out in the Indian Ocean that way. It's yet another trade route they have with India, who is one of their larger economic partners. So, with all of that being said, how much are they willing to dedicate to the European market? Now, I do think if there was a genuine overture for détente from the Europeans, they might be able to reestablish their trade ties with the Russians, at least to some degree. But this is just a cynical play, and I suppose you could say all of politics, all of geopolitics is a cynical play, but this is an especially cynical play where it's pretty bald-faced that they're not doing this as part of a greater strategic initiative. This is simply to thumb their nose at Washington, because that is the policy of so many U.S. allies, so many American vassals, when somebody like Trump is in office. I will say, until the end of time, Donald Trump gets snubbed for telling the Europeans to pay more for energy or spend more on NATO. Joe Biden can have their largest energy infrastructure project demolished overnight, and the president of Germany is pinning a medal on his chest. It's all about optics. Everything that happens, the Greenland thing, that's all optics. If this were somebody with a blue tie or from the right team trying to buy Greenland or trying to bully Denmark into greater access to Greenlandish resources or geography, there would be much more acquiescence. There wouldn't be this push towards quote-unquote strategic autonomy of the Europeans while still ultimately playing along with American geopolitical interests. But because Trump is in office, it's this petty game of back and forth that Trump is guilty of as well, I fully admit. But when the Europeans do it, it's just completely impotent. And speaking of impotence, we'll talk about the EU's threats to Vucic and Fico over the Victory Day parades in Moscow. So, the EU threatened, particularly Kallas, threatened Serbian EU candidacy if Vucic were to attend, and he thumbed his nose at them, and also there's been some stabilization of the situation in Serbia against the current protests, where it seems like Vucic's government has reconsolidated power and the protests are starting to die down. And then alternatively for Fico, it actually came out where the European Commission issued a statement that no, the European Union is not going to penalize countries or heads of state for diplomatic visits that they take. So it was completely shot down. But moving on to some of the other points out of Europe, we have Merz, who is slated to come into office on May 6th. And so far, the only member of the cabinet that is staying is Boris Pistorius, and you're going to get another Frankenstein cabinet. But Defense Minister Pistorius is still going to remain on staff, which, given his position towards Ukraine and Mertz's position towards Ukraine, completely holds up. But speaking of Pistorius, he said that Germany is unable to send any more Patriot systems to Ukraine because they are still awaiting their own deliveries. However, Merz at this point is still pushing for the delivery of Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and this is a policy as advocated for quite some time, and it plays into his whole remilitarization plan where they're going to implement austerity measures to German social spending in order to rebuild a war economy for a threat that doesn't exist to Germany, at least. And you have a similar case out of Belgium, where Belgium is cutting social security spending in order to meet NATO defense funds. And like I said, we can sit here on the other side of the Atlantic and I can sympathize with the talk. Well, if the Europeans are going to be in this defensive pact with us, they need to pay their fair share, blah, blah, blah. And like I said, that on the surface, yeah, I'm fine with that. I actually somewhat sympathize with that argument. But what we're doing is we're demanding more and more of the vassals while delivering less and less, which is what you start to get in late stage empires, where they're trying to cut costs in the empire, extract wealth from the colonies, and bring it home, which is a large degree what the tariffs are, on top of, say, a bludgeon against the Chinese, which we'll get into the tariffs towards the end of the episode. But when it comes to just final piece of news out of Europe that I'll cover before getting into, say, the division of labor talk, that is NATO plans to reinforce the Suwalki Gap. And I'll go ahead and get a map of that up in order to give you an idea of what the reinforcements will look like. And this is the gap between Poland and the Baltic states. So I'll go ahead and put a display here. So the Suwalki Gap right there is that border region between Poland, Kaliningrad, Russia, Lithuania, and Belarus. And you see the existing route they have for supply lines. This is the new route they want to build from Augustov to Vilnius, or Vilno, as the Poles would call it. And in response to Russian successes in Ukraine and uncertainty for American support in Europe, you are seeing more local defense initiatives of this type start to take place. And this also does, play into the idea that Europe, the European Union, NATO, are once again touting out that line: conflict with Russia in 10 years, conflict with Russia in 10 years, blah, 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 blah. But as for the London summit, Trump is not attending. I think at this point, I know Witkoff is attending, and from what I've seen, Rubio isn't, and this is supposed to be the big new push for support of Ukraine. And I guess what might happen is Rubio might show up. He will throw down the peace deal, which the attendees of the London summit have said they already disregard. They're going to come up with their own plan to support Ukraine in America's absence. And it's just going to be one of these other coalition of the losers, as it were, where they just impotently cling on to this policy, thumb their nose at Washington while indirectly doing its bidding once again. We see this time and time again. I'm sorry to keep hammering on this point, but that is what keeps happening. And if you want more proof of that happening, we'll get into more, in my opinion, evidence for the division of labor theory. And these are statements from Rubio. It seems like this is Rubio's domain, where he's the one who is at least pushing this policy. It does come from higher up, of course. But Rubio and Hegseth seem to be the ones who are really behind this, which it does explain their more pragmatic position on Russia because that must be pursued in order to meet their other goals. So Rubio had said, number one, China is the primary enemy on every front. That was one of his statements, which plays into that it's the role of America to confront China. And that the U.S. State Department had shut down its center on counteracting Russia and a number of other countries in this sphere of information, and that under the previous administration, this office, which cost taxpayer more than $50 million per year, spent millions of dollars trying to actively silence and censor the voice of Americans they were supposed to be serving. This is antithetical to the very principles we should be upholding, and inconceivable what was taking place in America at that end state. So he's referring to some of the State Department efforts for censorship, both on a domestic and international level, which, number one, yes, of course we know that was happening, and number two, they do decorate in flowery languages. They don't care about your freedom of expression. That's the reason why you see them trying to push through certain, maybe even not in a formal legal sense, but certain speech codes regarding certain nations in the Middle East. But that's the language they sell it to. But in this next memo, and this comes from the Washington Post, from the State Department, is that Trump would slash State Department funding in half, and that there was another memo released by the Trump administration to stop funding NATO, the UN, and 20 other organizations. Uh, Funds for humanitarian, global health, and international organizations are being sharply cut. It expects that U.S. aid will become fully part of the State Department, and all planned cuts would have to be reviewed by Congress. Blah 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 blah. And this is exactly what it is. Now, USAID, of course, that was one of the big things that came out. Trump got rid of USAID, and yes, he did set back their operations significantly, and I will give him all the credit in the world for that. But that was a consolidation move to put it under the purview of the State Department to make it more of a direct organ of regime change rather than this plausibly deniable organization, where yeah, they will continue their work, and that if you look to see some of the things that still get posted online by certain communities, I think the the suspension of funding to USAID has been a bit overstated, and that these NGOs will continue to operate in some way or another with the blessing of the American empire. And it just so happens to suit Trump's interest that it's streamlined under the State Department with somebody who is pretty servile to Trump, at least in his current role, that being Marco Rubio. And while they have scaled back their operations against, say, Russia, we're going to start seeing, say, more funds put into quote unquote independent media in East Asia, in places like Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, even, say, Japan, or uh, some might even say India. And I'll get into J.D. Vance's India visit and some of the stuff that happened with India and Pakistan, because that was a bizarre confluence of events that I still think is mostly coincidental, but I'll cover that when I get to it, because right now I want to go over the ongoing U.S. Iran talks and the fallout from those. So far, there have been two rounds of indirect talks between the Americans and the Iranians, with Steve Witkoff on the American side and Iran's foreign ministry and his team, and the foreign minister Abbas on the Iranian side. Excuse me, Abbas Araghchi, Abbas being his first name, Araghchi his surname, was leading the negotiations, and these took place in Muscat, Oman, which Oman has been a traditional mediator between the U.S. and Iran ever since the 1979 revolution. Now, Witkoff and the Iranian delegations did not directly meet. Rather, the Omanis uh, sent message back and forth on their behalf. But right now, Witkoff, of course, being the very cordial man he is, reports nothing but positive things. Of course, he has experience negotiating Qatar with the Qataris and using them as a proxy to negotiate with the political leadership of Hamas. So at this point, he's pretty well set in his role, and the Iranians came to the negotiating table with the following demands, which is the immediate access to $1 billion of Iran's frozen assets abroad, reducing restrictions on Iranian oil imports, and rapid easing of sanctions on the Iranian nuclear program. And there may be some evidence the Americans have made those concessions in order to continue the talks with Iran. Iran has categorically rejected the Libya option, which the Israelis actually put on the table. And that, for those of you who don't know, is Gaddafi d- completely disarmed in no less than 10 years. He was overthrown. But to continue on that point, just some brief points on the Iranian negotiations. For starters, I don't think either side really expects much progress from these negotiations, and that they're both really just trying to buy time. The Iranians are trying to buy time on their side, the Americans are trying to buy time on their side as well. And that the U.S. still has likely not given up on regime change and the removal of the current Iranian government. And that at a certain point, the Iranians can only take the words of the Americans so far, because we already had the JCPOA, which was torn up by Trump. Now Trump wants to more or less have a JCPOA 2.0. We have American negotiations with Syria, Libya, Iraq, which all result in regime change. And some are speculating, I think this is probably the most reasonable speculation of this, is the reason the Americans are eager to enter in these negotiations is that based on our strikes in Yemen, we've lost confidence in our bunker busters, which if there were to be a strategic strike on Iranian military or nuclear facilities, that would require bunker buster bombs. And given their use in Yemen, coming from sources from CENTCOM, the attacks against Yemeni infrastructures were, quote, ineffective at best and useless at worst. And if that's just the Yemenis, I'm not going to downplay their missile program, because they have harassed American forces, Saudis, and Israelis for a number of years now to great success. So I'm not going to say that they just have a bottle rocket program. It's advanced far beyond that. But if American weaponry, particularly the bunker busters, are struggling to make headway in Yemen, any hopes of, say, an Iranian strike would just be out the window, even if it were to be paired jointly with the Israelis, because I know the Israelis are adamant about formulating their own strike right now to undermine U.S. negotiations, because they are quite dissatisfied with the fact that the Americans are entering into these negotiations on their behalf, mind you, doing this more or less completely for Israel and their interest in trying to ease tensions so they can get some more breathing room because of the strategic corner Israel has painted itself into, but we'll put that aside. And what proposal came out that I found quite entertaining is that allegedly the Iranians agreed to denuclearization, to dismantle their program down to certain levels, down to a civilian infrastructure level, if the Israelis were willing to denuclearize. And there was quite a funny occurrence with one of the pressers in Israel. I believe it was actually somebody from RT was asking some Israeli official about the comment, and they just completely snubbed them. So that was entertaining to say the least. And I mean, it's a reasonable proposal. I don't think the Iranians ever expect that to happen, but it's beyond the capability of the U.S. at this point, because we can't pull Israel's leash on that issue. But the best way to make sure the Iranians don't get the bomb is to take it away from Israel, to restore something of a balance of power. That would give Israel much less ability to act so harshly in its own interests, but that might be the price they have to pay. They might have to learn how to live in their own neighborhood if they're going to exist as a state going into the future, and not hold not only the region but the world in nuclear blackmail. There might have to be a different way, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think Israel is more likely to implement the Samson option before that happens, so it's best not to get our hopes up. Now, as a result of the talks, even though there was some success, the Iranian Foreign Ministry did release a statement accusing the Americans of quote unquote moving the goalpost and a lack of seriousness and good faith. And this is due to the proposed change in location of the talks. And also, Witkoff did waffle a bit, where he did take a bit more of a hawkish line, more likely to appeal to, say, the more neocon side of the Trump administration. So that's not shocking that we would see that. But the Iranians keep insisting that they want to maintain their nuclear program as their right to what they call and what they appeal to in UN documents, the IAEA, their right to pursue peaceful atomic energy. Now, it does look like there's possibly a good cop, bad cop situation going on with America and Israel, where America is trying to give the Iranians an off ramp. If you just make an agreement with us, we'll make sure everything's great. We'll work with you to break down economic barriers and lift sanctions and decrease military tension in the region, while the Israelis are constantly hammering on about a strike. However, to show the direction the Iranians think the negotiations will go in, we do have their agreements they've been signing with the Russians. And this started, the first round of this recently was actually on January 20th, Trump's inauguration day, where Iran and Russia signed new strategic cooperation pacts. And Putin and Pezeshkian have furthered those agreements with the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Agreement, the CSPA, and it's described as a much more comprehensive agreement than, say, previous Iranian-Russian agreements, which include security, cooperation, peaceful nuclear energy, economic coordination, and what they refer to as mutual resistance against unilateral coercive measures, which refers to threats of sanctions and military action against the Iranians. Now, Lavrov said of the pact that it was finalized, quote, despite the challenging global landscape and efforts to pressure our countries. He didn't name names, but it's pretty evident that he was referring to the Americans and, to a lesser extent, the Israelis. And this is all happening at the same time of the American negotiations with Iran, and what we've seen with the Americans being unreliable partners, where Trump tore up the Iran deal, and now he's more or less proposing the Iran deal with some extra caveats again, and it makes the U.S. look even more unreliable than it is, when realistically we could wash our hands of the situation, much like the Russia-Ukraine issue. We could wash our hands of the situation. We could back off and leave the region to its own devices. There would have to be some protection of our interests, say, in the Gulf states, which are on working terms with the Iranians right now. And so at this point, it really does all just come down to the fact that Israel is paranoid. Israel feels its security is under threat. Israel is not willing to make any compromise. So even the argument for our energy trade for the Gulf states, that's gone out the window because of the reconciliation efforts we've seen there, and those only continue to increase. And I'll go over some of the details of the meeting between the Saudi and Iranian foreign ministers. But all that being said, I will focus on some news regarding Israel at this point, uh, in relation to Iran. Now, there are speculations to return to the idea of good cop, bad cop, where the Americans are going to play coy with the Iranians, where they're going to negotiate, where they're going to have the diplomatic overtures, while the Israelis come in and deliver the quote unquote knockout blow and do conduct strikes against particularly Iranian nuclear targets, but also we might see attacks against other military facilities. But a lot of that assumes that the Israelis have conducted a proper seed campaign suppression of enemy air defenses, which, despite their claims, despite the claims of many others, has not been the case, and that Iranian air defenses are still functional. And with their strategic pacts with Iran and with China and Russia, they're likely to receive even more advanced missile systems at some point in the future. Now, some may say the Russians are not going to bail out the Iranians, the Chinese are not going to bail out the Iranians, and while I don't think it'll be a direct involvement, while I don't think you'll see Russian quote unquote boots on the ground in order to solve this, strategically speaking, it would behoove both countries to act in the interest of defending Iran's current position. As I had said previously, with the international north south corridor that the Russians have through the Caspian Sea into Iran and into the Indian Ocean, that has become a vital trade route for them. Iran is a massive hub of energy for the Chinese, which is one of the other reasons the Americans are also engaging so heavily in that. It's not just the Israel issue; it's the fact that they are playing a wider, I guess you could say, chess game against the Chinese as well, and Iran is a valuable component of that, which they want to flip either through force or through diplomacy, and we'll see if they can make that happen. I don't think that's going to happen, but no, I don't think, barring some sort of breakdown of civil society in Iran, which is possible because the regime is not as strong as it once was. I'm not saying it's likely, but it is certainly in the realm of possibility. You're not going to get any sort of shift in the balance of power when it comes to the agreements between Russia and Iran and China. And even in the situation where you do have the current regime start to fall apart, I would imagine, I can't say it for certain, that both Russia and China either have contacts or have means to contact any sort of opposition figure that would be waiting in the wings. But even at this point, it doesn't seem like there's an organized opposition that would be able to take power in Iran. And I think that's probably the main reason the regime is still in place, even despite its growing weaknesses, is the fact that there's really no concerted opposition effort to depose them. And barring outright conflict, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. But once again, I think I said this a number of years ago, and while there still are concerns, and while I don't discount the possibility entirely, I think the idea of American military engagement with Iran that that book has been closed. We're not going to see that re-engage. The Americans are simply not in a position to do it. Even strategic strikes are an iffy question. But the Israelis will keep pushing it, especially so long as Likud is in power, so long as parties like Likud in power, they will keep pushing the security issue with the Iranians. But to cover further Israeli news, you do have the French speculation or the speculation that France will adopt a two-state solution, and in response to that, Israel has barred 23 French MPs from the country. And this comes after a couple diplomatic rows between Israel and France lately. One was the alleged firing on French peacekeeper by Israeli forces, and also some, of course, tense talks between Netanyahu and Macron, where, as we've seen with Lebanon, the French want to play mediator in the region, and that they are closer to recognizing a Palestinian state. And you know what? If they do, I think that's actually a good thing. I'll give Macron all the credit in the world for that, because it does take an arrow out of the quiver of Israel that one of the major Western countries, one of its major backers, um, in more recent years, is going to try to force them to the bargaining table. And I don't think much will come of it, but I think the more pressure Israel has exerted on it, even from its own backers, is better, because it does box in Israel further and it keeps them from acting more unhinged. I'm not saying this would be a great degree of change, but it would be change nonetheless, and it might lead to more major European states signing on to this. And I mean, I don't think the Germans are ever going to, because Germany has a very special relationship with Israel. But several countries in Europe have started to recognize the Palestinian state, which I do think is progress. Uh, but the elephant in the room, no pun intended for the Republican Party, is the Americans, and they're simply not going to, not under the current political paradigm, especially as the interests that surround Trump continue to whisper in his ear more and more about Middle Eastern policy. You're not going to get recognition of the Palestinian state from the U.S. In which case, if that ever does happen, I think at that point the Israelis are going to be forced to concede because they don't have that level of leverage over, say, their primary benefactor that they once did, and that they might have to start cutting some agreements if they want to survive as a state into the future. But who knows if that would even happen? Uh, that's looking too far in the future to really make an accurate assessment. But not to dwell on too much longer, you do have the current tensions between Israel and Turkey continuing, that they have failed to reach an agreement when it came to a de-conflictization zone in Syria. And you have the U.S. pushing for this, but to little avail. And where we might see the U.S. succeed diplomatically to some degree is that Trump has his first foreign visits laid out. I mentioned this last episode, actually similar to his first term. Trump is taking a visit to the Gulf states, and that he will be visiting Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. And he also informed them they would have no financial support. He informed them that no financial support should be provided to Lebanon until there's clarity on Iran, particularly the disarmament of Hezbollah. So it does look like he's going to be going over there to press the issue when it comes to the security situation in the Levant for Israel regarding Hezbollah, where he does not want the Gulf states investing in Lebanon. He does not want them, hell, maybe even investing in Syria at that point, because I know that Saudi Arabia has offered to take on Syria's IMF debt and pay it off just as such a favor to Jelani. But when it comes to Trump's visit, what I think the primary goal is here is to sell them on yet another anti-Iran coalition, while at the same time the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and Qatar, are reconciling with the Iranians. And I think this is Trump's attempt at a diplomatic maneuver in order to maybe not stop that process, because that would require much more effort, but to put a stopper in that process, to slow it down, to delay it, to restore some confidence in American leadership in the region, where the Gulf states may start to look at China with a more skeptical eye, or be less cooperative with the Chinese, who in large part help facilitate détente with Iran. Because although Trump seems to be taking a less explicitly hawkish approach, he still does want concessions, if not outright capitulation, from the Iranians, which, if he were to pursue the maximum pressure campaign, assuming the formality of Witkoff's negotiations fall through, then he's going to need the Gulf states on his side. And it's becoming a bigger and bigger ask as time goes on. But with the aforementioned meeting between the Saudis and the Iranians, media outlet Amwaj reports that King Salman sent a letter to Khomeini in Iran, and that was received very positively. Some of the points of that is he expressed support for U.S.-Iran talks regarding the Iranian nuclear program and urged Iran to make a deal that would stabilize the region. Notably, in 2015, Saudi Arabia opposed the nuclear deal. So Saudi Arabia, once again, we've seen how they've shifted on the global stage. This letter reflects that. But they still don't want to see a nuclear Iran because it would upset the balance of power too much. And they also do still have some American interests that they need to appeal to, because Saudi Arabia still does receive a great degree of benefit from its relationship with the Americans, even if that has shifted over the recent years. He also expressed the willingness of Saudi Arabia to play an active part in these negotiations and offered to host informal meetings between Iran and the U.S. during Trump's upcoming visit to Riyadh, which the Iranians rejected. Salman urged Iran to use regional influence to convince Yemen's Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthi, not to target Saudi Arabia or the UAE and to reduce tensions in the Red Sea. Confirmed the position of Saudi Arabia in regard to Palestine. Saudi Arabia will never recognize Israel without the formation of a widely recognized and fully independent Palestinian state. And lastly, Salman expressed positive views towards an Iranian Saudi bilateral security pact, uh, which steps will be taken soon to realize. So, diplomatic progress between the two countries does continue unabated. Some people thought in Trump's upcoming term that when he took office, you would see a return to form from the Iranians, or from the Saudis more so, where you would see tensions and hostilities with Iran resumed. And the final piece of news I have out of the Gulf is that Oman, which recently hosted U.S. Iran talks, refused to allow U.S. Navy vessels and carrier strike groups to refuel and replenish stocks at Omani ports. So they're trying to play a very neutral line, which is not a surprise for the Omanis. It would derail talks if they aren't already derailed. But at the time, before we really saw what the outcome was going to be, it would derail talks if they were to take such a resolute move. And the last piece of Middle Eastern news I will leave you with is that the U.S. is finally starting to see significant drawdowns from Syria, and that we are seeing forces leave. So far, there's been about 600 who have been transferred out of the country. You have U.S. forces in the region, particularly in Jordan, coordinating this withdrawal effort. As we see American strategic interests shift to other parts of the world, particularly the Asia Pacific. And this possibly could be a sign that the idea of another engagement in the Middle East is starting to come off the table because Trump wants to walk away now that Assad is gone. Israel has more reign in Syria. Turkey, which is ostensibly a U.S. ally, also has reign in Syria, so he feels no need for the American presence to be there. Nobody has really paid attention to this because it's been overshadowed by so many other news items, so Trump hasn't even drawn the criticism of quote-unquote abandoning the Kurds like they tried to lob at him in 2019, to little avail. But moving on to our last couple of big news items, I'll start with some of the trade talk updates before getting into India-Pakistan. So, for starters, Trump has expressed interest in meeting Chinese President Xi Jinping in person. However, Beijing fears the Republican will turn the leaders' meeting into a spectacle, and he wants the U.S. to appoint someone responsible for trade negotiations, according to Politico. And in overtures to China, which he previously put the very harsh tariffs on, the White House is considering slashing China tariffs to de-escalate the trade war in order to enter negotiations. So Trump came in extremely, I guess you could say hot. I don't want to use the word strong because that would imply there would have been some success here, that he would have been able to strong arm the Chinese out of something. But he came in extremely hot with these astronomical tariffs to the point where it clearly was a shot across the bow, if not an outright declaration of trade war. China responded in kind, and now you have Trump blinking first. And he wants to meet with Xi Jinping, and allegedly that meeting is to take place in May. And that Trump, of course, did what he always does when he was asked about it, continue on with the rhetoric saying, I have a great relationship with Xi, we get along so well, we want to be competitors, we don't want to be rivals, we want to sit down, we want to have productive talks, blah, 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 blah. Trump's typical butter him up routine then leading into these meetings, but I don't think there's going to be much progress even if they do meet in May in order to satiate this trade war. I think certain lines that have been crossed cannot be uncrossed, and we will see that continue into the future because both countries at this point, I think, are pretty dead set on bifurcation from each other, and that it's in, I suppose both of their interests, at least their strategic interests, to begin preparing for the worst against one another and anticipating a wider conflict. But ultimately, when it comes to Trump's tariffs, what we ended up with was some flat 10% tariffs on several nations, and China, which was supposed to be the big target, we've completely balked on, and that this was a very poor thought out policy. While I was never Team Trump 40 chess, I at least thought initially there could be some broader strategy behind it, but it does look like this was something that they just went in full throttle and were not able to handle the consequences of that. So it's egg on Trump's face, and I hope because of that it does not make him more aggressive in other theaters in order to make up for that. But finally, we have the news out of India and Pakistan. So, for starters, you had J.D. Vance visiting India, and he gave a speech in India, which is very reminiscent of, say, a speech that you would hear from a BRICS nation. And some might even call it, quote unquote, third worldist. But it was appealing more to India as a partner rather than some of the more lecturing tone that you might get from the Biden administration or the Eurocrats or some of these other Western powers, where to go over some key points that J.D. Vance made in his speech in India, uh, the prior administration saw India as a source of low cost labor. I mean, so does the current administration, as they criticized the Prime Minister's government, saying that Trump's White House looks to build a relationship of equals with India, and Modi's government calling it arguably the most popular government in the democratic world. Saying liberal peace through sameness has failed, channeling some multipolar rhetoric, which I think is inevitable at this point. Saying that Trump doesn't want to return old manufacturing. That's not the goal of the trade war, but he wants to, rebalance trade with the entire world, and India is a part of that. In which case, we're starting to see the framework where they don't want to rely on China for strategic manufacturing, and they are starting to shift that to India, who they view as a more reliable partner, despite its membership in BRICS, despite its close relationship with Russia, and despite its growing ties with China as well, even despite some of the other tensions. He wants India to tighten defense manufacturing with the United States even further, not because we seek war, but because we seek peace, putting in the platitudes, and wants India to buy more American made weapons and equipment because we believe they are the best in class. And finally, saying that the Indo Pacific region must remain safe from any hostile power that seeks to dominate it, which is clearly in reference to China, and that he does want to create a degree of enmity between India and China, which historically has existed, but in recent years has tapered off because of recent diplomatic overtures and also many of the foreign policy failures of the Biden administration allowed for those doors to be opened, where countries that were formerly on maybe not the best footing with each other were able to start to reconcile. And we did see the framework for that between China and India, particularly through BRICS. But it does look like the Americans are trying to throw a wrench in that. It is worth noting that J.D. Vance, of course, because of his familial connections, maybe does have some vested interest in seeing a deeper U.S.-India partnership. And I'm not just saying that as like a joke or ha 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 he married an Indian, whatever. But I'm genuinely asking that. I mean, he has his children who are of that ethnic background, at least partially. His wife, who's from there, and presumably at that point his in-laws as well, and extended family, so on and so forth. So, because of all of that, he probably does have a vested personal interest in seeing deeper cooperation between the United States and India on a number of issues, particularly militarily, and also viewing them as the weak link in BRICS that can be pried away, which I would say he's mostly right. Brazil is probably an easier target, but it has its own intricacies. Under the Biden administration, you had Lula, who was very heavily tied to the American Democratic Party. So I wouldn't say Brazil was neutralized from BRICS then, but there were some conflicts of interest. However, it was the same thing under Bolsonaro. Now I know that BRICS wasn't as prominent during Bolsonaro's term in office, but he maintained good relationship with the Russians, more hostile towards the Chinese, but was also in good terms with, say, the Trump White House, not so much the Biden White House. In fact, one might speculate that they actually interfered in the Brazilian election to ensure a certain outcome. But getting back to India, I'm going to cover the attack that happened in Kashmir. This happened in Palagam, which is in Kashmir in Indian-controlled territory. According to Indian media, 43 people were dead and 20 were injured as a result of the attack. However, other sources claim 22 dead, 12 injured. Among those casualties, they included majority Hindus, 3 local Muslims, 1 Emirati citizen, 1 Italian, 1 Israeli, and 1 Nepali. Now, Palagam is in the region a popular tourist destination that typically has very high level of security. Now, India almost immediately fired a shot across the bow against Pakistan and said that they had involvement in this. The Pakistanis denied involvement, of course, and that they did not coordinate this attack. Now, at the time, this coincided with Modi being on a diplomatic visit to Saudi Arabia and J.D. Vance being on a diplomatic visit to India. I believe there was a brief window where they did meet with each other and did speak to each other, but Modi was leaving for Saudi Arabia while J.D. Vance was arriving for talks with the Indian government. So he's probably meeting with, at that point, the president, cabinet members, etc. And we saw this, we just went over the speech that he gave. Now, according to some sources, and like I said, this is still relatively new, so we don't know how true this is going to be. This was a pre-planned operation by the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a militant group that is pro-India and allegedly has ties to the Indian government. And they allegedly planned this for, or I'm sorry, pro-Pakistani group with ties to Pakistan, but that's the Indian accusation, and then the BJP, which I referred to, is the pro-India group. Just to clarify that. Apologies for any confusion there. But some say this was a false flag in order to give the Indians more leverage against Pakistan, but relations between the two countries have deteriorated even further, and that we've seen so far out of the rumor mill where BJP-backed media is starting to blame local Muslim populations, saying the Pakistanis were involved, and you had the suspension of several treaties at this point between India and Pakistan, and a general breakdown in the peace framework. It's worth noting these flare-ups do happen semi-frequently, the most recent one being in 2019, where the two countries almost came to blows. Both of them are nuclear powers, mind you, so for those of you who are betting on nuclear war, it's more than likely going to be the Indian subcontinent if, God forbid, it ever does happen. But a lot of people will bank on Ukraine with Russia and, say, the European powers of the United States. Some might say the Asia Pacific. But it's more or less, if a nuclear weapon is going to be used in combat, it's probably going to come from the Indian subcontinent. And I expect this issue, once again, to blow over. I don't think there is anyone at this point who has a vested interest in pushing the conflict. I know that the speculation from the pro-India groups that the Pakistanis did this in order to drive a wedge during the American visit, so on and so forth, and that the claim of the pro-Pakistani side is that India did this so it could solidify its claims on Kashmir, so it could increase its military presence there, so on and so forth. These kind of mutual accusations that go around. But the Russians and the Chinese, the BRICS states, have no interest in the conflict escalating. The Americans at this point, I don't think would be interested in any sort of conflict or any sort of breakdown in diplomatic relations in the Indian subcontinent. So, like several other instances we've seen, this is probably going to result no more and no more than, say, some border skirmishes. At least that's my read on the situation. But this is a new developing situation. We will have to keep an eye on it. But it is yet another potential conflict or burgeoning conflict in a world that has seen really a complete breakdown in the post-war order just within the past couple of years, for better and for worse. In some parts, that order needed to go, but we have seen the consequences, and that is a lot of these issues are now being litigated through military force and through sheer violence. And it may just be more of indicative of the world that we're living in right now, but I hope this doesn't come to blows. I don't think this would be advantageous to anyone in the world right now, especially if nuclear weapons are launched. That could very quickly create a catastrophic effect. And so far, right now, the extent to which the neighboring countries have gotten involved is that the Iranians urged India to exercise caution when it comes to its dealings with Pakistan in response to this attack. Now, Iran enjoys decent relations with both India and Pakistan, so they are not explicitly taking a side. However, Iranian Pakistani cooperation has deepened in recent years. But this is a situation like the other skirmishes that could very quickly spiral out of control, but now in a world that is much less stable, much more volatile, and much more prone to conflict than in previous decades. But that's all I had for this week, and I hope you guys enjoyed yet another solo episode. I only want to keep it about an hour and a half because I know these things can get rambly with only one person. But we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.